Hello.
Hi, Sandy.
I think we're going to aim to get under an hour.
We are? Okay. Let's see what we
Yeah,
can do.
we managed it last time. Tonight, I've cut my images down to three, and our title tonight is The Imitation. And the reason why it's The Imitation is because I've been thinking a lot about how we talk about our experience leading us to like how we perceive and interpret art. But likewise, I've been thinking a lot about how obviously experience is then funneled into the artwork itself. And really, because we were talking so much the other evening about particularly Tracy Emin and how there's almost like a sense of confessional art with what she does.
Hmm.
Um, but beyond that, thinking that does one have to experience something in order to record it, to imitate it, and deliver it and express it into the wider world as a piece of artwork? What do you think about that, Bill?
Um, I think it's a good question. I think that there are some people who are extraordinary mimics and can imagine what something is like and do a pretty darn good job representing it. And I
Mm,
think there are others who probably have gone through that experience who also can't represent it in any way
mm,
outside of themselves.
yeah.
I think that we've all seen art that moves us that has nothing to do with the artist's experience. So
Well, I was trying to think of a good example of that, really. I mean, I was looking even at, if you type in something like world's most famous paintings and Mona Lisa pops up,
mhm.
Starry Night, Girl with a Pearl Earring, Last Supper, all the usual things that we would expect to see. But one of them that came up is the Caspar David Friedrich. It's called like View in the Fog or something, and it's the man atop the mountain looking out over the range, and we see him
Oh,
from
okay.
the back. Yeah, it's a very famous painting.
Yep.
And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, I do wonder if the painter had traversed the mountains, and I do
Right.
wonder if the painter had ever actually seen that scene.
This is a like a romantic painting. This
Yeah,
what we're talking about. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, of course, right. That is probably very likely just his imagination of what he imagined the beautiful, you know, wilds of England or Germany or wherever the heck he was from, how he imagined them being. Um, that's almost fantastical in some ways,
it
paintings like
is.
that, right?
But I wonder, if that's like the skill as artists is to deliver a vision,
Yeah, yeah.
isn't it? And that vision doesn't have to be real.
Well, the also you could separate the literal of the work from uh, uh, the emotion in the work, in the sense that it could be that somebody is just particularly good at making you feel a certain way as the viewer that may have nothing to do with their experiences and might not have anything to do with what you even think that story is about. You and I have talked about pieces of work that were incredibly sad.
Mm.
Were they actually sad, or did it just make us feel sad? There was nothing specifically sad about certain images. It could just be, the tropes and things that are stuck in our head that it fires off when we look at them.
Well, exactly. I mean, if we take away our conditioning,
Yep.
what are we actually left with? Because, humans tend to want to assign and identify. They want to assign something to themselves in some way so that they can identify with it.
Yep.
And, if we didn't have the conditioning that makes us do that, then I wonder what we would see. And also in looking, as you say, are we being manipulated by artists perhaps who are just really good at making us feel things?
I think we're
Um,
being manipulated all the time. I think the answers to those are I don't know what would be left without our preconceived notions, and I think we're always being manipulated.
mm.
you know, is this a drawing? How do, what media is this?
It's an etching, and I just realised that my word is not in italic, which annoys me, but that's not the focus on the page. Women with Dead Child, 1903, Kathe Kollwitz. Very,
Yeah.
very well regarded artist in her lifetime. She was a well-known artist. She was prodigious talent. She was the first woman, I think, who was accepted into one of the main arts universities. Um, she came from what I would consider quite a cultured background. And though not totally rolling in it and completely wealthy, she did have a life that exposed her in her early life to affluence, but also tragedy. So all of her siblings, I think, died when she was still a child. I think there were 5 children, maybe.
And four of
Um,
them were dead.
and she was the only surviving child, I think. It was something
Eh,
like that. So she'd grown up in this situation where she was an early talent. She was spotted early on, I think, by her grandfather. And he encouraged her to go to art college, and she experimented with a wide range of media. And she married Dr. Kollwitz. Um, I think genuinely a love match from what I can understand. And they lived in Berlin, and he tended to the sick who were very poor, the working classes. And at that point, she'd had enormous personal tragedy to navigate as a younger woman. But she hadn't ever really been exposed, I don't suppose, to destitution.
was she a mother at that point?
So, I mean, you and I talked very briefly before we started. This is Women with Dead Child.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk about so many, parity with Pietà, with Mary cradling Christ. We could think
Sure.
about Picasso and Guernica and then the Weeping Women. There's so many ways and iterations in which this sense, this scene is portrayed and reaches out to us.
I mean, it's certainly an archetype in that way. Do you, I mean, just quick aside, do you think that the fact that this is such a common image, the subject matter is such a common subject matter, that it's such a common subject matter, and yet it is one of the more awful things that could happen to a human? Do you think that because it's so common, it dilutes the intensity of it in some way? Not this particular picture, but images like this in general. Like there's so many of them that you're overwhelmed with them in art history.
No, and I think, thinking about kind of like an archetypal image that transcends all time. I would say, and I'm sure some very learned anthropologist, historian will come up and maybe correct me or support me to say that actually throughout all of our human history, the worst thing for a mother is to lose their child.
Yeah.
Now, that may be on a sliding scale of relativity, depending on the expectation of the mother, uh, sadly, because of where she may live. There's a higher likelihood of a child dying in a famine-ridden country
Yep.
or in a country that's torn with war than here, in leafy England. Nonetheless, I would say that there is no dilution to this, the sense of that comes as generated by this image, what it means, what it represents.
Well, you're a mother. Do you think your view of this would be different now than it would have been 15, 20 years ago?
It's different, but I would still say, I don't know if this is particular to me or if this again is a kind of more universal thing. But even when I was not yet a mother, I understood the sacred nature of this relationship between a mother and her child. and I
Sure.
understood it at a very deep level, as I'm sure a lot of probably quite sensitive people will do. And I don't know if that then means that everybody feels that.
Right. Yeah.
Um, anyway, what's interesting about this, in 1903, I think Kollwitz was a young mum, or she had young children. She had 2 boys, 2 sons. And that in itself, I think, is quite an interesting thing, because I have to say, when I first did become a mother, the very last thing I would have wanted to depict in my work was my dead child. It was
Okay.
almost like it's unapproachable because it's so,
I have an alternate interpretation of this.
yeah.
What if she's not the mother? What if she's the child? And it's about her mother and her childhood. It has nothing to do with her kids.
Well, I think there is a big part of this is to do with her siblings, and an understanding from a different perspective, but nonetheless still a very powerful vantage on a mother's grief and what
Yeah.
that must be like.
Or even a, you know, a nightmare of a situation where she herself died after her siblings did, and you know, her mother was left with no children, and this was her own fear of any of that kind of thing, you know, that kind of thing.
I mean, I remember having conversations with my mum when I was still very young, and inquiring what would happen to my mum if I were to die.
Yeah.
I was a very sickly child, and I spent a lot of time being very unwell and in hospital. And these kinds of things, I was aware of these things.
Sure.
And I was curious about it. I was also terrified of it. I was terrified of it from my mum. And obviously my dad and my grandparents, but specifically and particularly my mum. I was really worried about it.
Did you bring this stuff up with your mom?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said,
Okay,
I asked her.
so what did she say to this? Was she just like, don't worry about it?
She did say to me once, don't ever put all your eggs in one basket.
Have lots of children just in case.
And here I am with one child.
Yeah.
But I really hope not to in any way pass on to my own child this incredible death fear because of me. You know, that there's a real sense of like an enormous pressure, perhaps again on a sensitive child, realizing that if something were to happen to them, the mother would not just be bereft, but that in so many ways a mother might feel that the life she has lived or would have lived is in actual fact over.
Yeah.
And of course that's the same with all death, isn't it? You know, we're navigating that all the time through death. I just also want to talk purely visually about this. I don't know if anybody else thinks this or sees this when they look at this image, but every single etched mark, every single tiny wrinkle is almost like an ode to feeling somehow. That all these marks together make this recognizable image. But there's something so almost, it's a feral image, I think. It goes beyond 1903, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lack of clothing obviously takes it out of time. Um, the way the mother's foot is up on her leg, you know, as like a um,
Well, it's the drawing in of the body. It's the drawing in close, and there's
yeah,
not many drawings or paintings actually that do this so powerfully. This sense of closeness of these two
it's
characters.
more of a photographic reality rather than the romantic imagery that you usually see of mother and child.
Mm. I
Uh,
mean, Kollwitz in her lifetime sort of straddled this, you know, pigeonholing. You know, was she working in realism? Was she an expressionist? What was she doing? And I think her I mean, rejection is a very negative word, but it was actually her rejection of painting, for example. She wanted to draw and she wanted to etch, possibly because the currency of that is so much more focused on some other quality. Colorlessness often gives itself to a much more powerful dynamic in allowing over to the audience something for them to see, decide, feel.
I also visually, I look at the child in this, and at least their face and neck is so much brighter and sort of more pristine than the sort of I would say dirtiness of the mother in this case, you know, and the shadows on the right hand side. Um, but that the child's eyelids and the mother, it, the mother and the child are very much sort of mirrors of each other's faces through time in some ways, where they almost look like they could be the same person at different points of their life cycles.
See, I don't agree with that at all, actually. And the reason for that is because of the pure physical presence of the mother, how strong she looks, how big her arm is, how solid her foot. Now, Kollwitz, as I said, her husband tended the sick and needy in amongst the neediest of all Berlin. And that sort of urban landscape would have been full in her lifespan of people who were returning from war, people who were migrating to a city from farming communities.
Yeah, refugees.
Yeah. And so there's something very much, an echo of all of that in this woman.
Doesn't it in some ways also kind of feel like, I hate to use this term, in the same way that a lot of the American Depression photographs were almost like propaganda about the poor. It has an element of that as well.
Kollwitz died in 1945. Her work was systematically removed from galleries by the Nazis.
Oh, okay.
And yet one image, and it may have been this image actually, was used in their propaganda about what would happen if the scourge of the world were allowed to persist.
Yeah.
The
need to stand up and
and she furiously opposed that. I mean, there's lots written about her. She's very easy to read up about, and I would urge anybody who's not familiar with her to go and look at almost like a service in life through art. But I'm still coming back to this idea of imitation. This woman is actually not Kathe Kollwitz. The imitation is by observation.
Yeah, but you got to imagine that it is, there's elements of all of that in there. I mean, no, yes, it could be that she's seeing some refugee mother and her dead child, and she's seen all these images. She understands the plight of the poor in Prussia at the time. All of that's true. But it could also be that she also, in some ways, sees herself in either of the roles, depending on where she is in her life, and that all blends together because she has some knowledge of what that's like. She can perceive of the poor woman differently than somebody who hadn't had experience with dead children.
Well, I think this is where, I do wonder, but I talk about art as a generosity, as you know, frequently. I often see art as a generosity of the artist giving back into the slipstream of the world, something human. And the compassion in this particular piece of work is to me, very powerful. And I wonder whether Kollwitz, what she intended really in terms of our response with this image.
Are there no writings or interviews or anything of her on any of these subjects?
There will be. I just haven't read it.
Yeah,
haven't seen it. I mean, as I say, her life is well documented. But yes, I mean, there's lots of classical references again in this. I mentioned the Pietà already.
Sure.
There's definitely something of the animal taking us to a base level of our own humanity. This is the point at which we can go no further, lower. We can't sink into, maybe not even sadness, but we can't be anywhere else but this place with this person at this moment. And yet this person isn't just one person, is it? It's all of us. And so I wonder about artists who are able not just to imitate, that there's something else to it. You know, an imitation is, you know, the facsimile, the copy. But when we use phrases like the real deal, I do wonder if this is the real deal. It's not an imitation of anything, although it is imitated many times and comes from imitation because it's such a recognizable image. And though the picture is not the thing, though the word is not the thing, the fact is through this representation by Kollwitz, we actually come up upon the profound depth of it.
It's also interesting, and as I recall, the one of the other images we're going to look at tonight, um, even though all we see is the torso of the child, because you see both feet and a hand and the head of the mother, it's almost like there are multiple people involved in grabbing this child. You know, like there's limbs coming out of nowhere, kind of. You know what I mean?
Also, the child, though very different, you know, as you pointed out, the child is very light.
Yeah.
The fact is that where we have the arm, the foot, the hand, the other foot, the knee, the torso is occupied, the entirety of that space is occupied by the child. And of course, that is that the child, one's child does come from the mother's body, grown in that mid space, that vital part. This thing that, you know, we just really can't, we don't exist without.
You know, if that child is well, the child is dead in her own description, but it's also, it's going to sound really terrible and I don't mean it as much, I'm just using artistic terms, there's also a negative space of where the child once was, because that child's kind of no longer there even though they're in their arms. You know what I mean?
I mean, 1903, Kollwitz, born 1867, died in 1945, as I said. She lived through quite an extraordinary period of history, really.
Yep.
Negative space.
Are you offended by that term in this case?
No, not at all.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There just would have been a lot of grief from a lot of mothers, wouldn't there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is neither here nor there, but it's not quite, but it is very squarish composition too. So there's like a box like contained feeling to it all.
Also, I mean, this is a more kind of anecdotal thing, but there are lots of stories from this period where starving families in the freezing wastes of northeastern Germany would, I've heard stories about mothers eating their dead children.
Sure.
And that's not about a sustenance because of starvation, though of course that's part of it. It's actually about taking the body back into the body from which it came. This need to, once again, subsume. I mean, people might rip me apart for mentioning this even, but That's so profound.
Yeah. Yeah.
That need, you know, a child has died, that most horrific thing, to need to have the child taken back into the body. But I think your point about, you know, we're not sure, I said Kathe Kollwitz is not the mother. You're quite right, she could be the child.
Isn't it interesting though that when we see those kinds of things, imagery like that, well, when it comes to more Christian symbolism, like true Christian symbolism, where it's
Hmm.
literally Mary and Jesus, of course, the baby is Jesus, we tend to feel for the mother in that instance. We tend to identify with the mother. We don't tend to identify with the child in the mother's arms.
But is that simply because the mother is the living element?
Maybe, yeah. But I
Rather
mean,
than,
I guess we tend to make the mother the center of the story.
well, you know,
In that, in
this one is also about mother and child.
okay,
And Charlotte Salomon is often described as a Holocaust artist. And I think that is, if not a misrepresentation, certainly a bit of misdirection, in that, yes, she was a Jew. Yes, she did die in Auschwitz. But no, her life was not entirely about her end.
right.
And indeed, her work, all these many gouaches, and there are many, many of them, well over, I think, definitely over 50 of them collected in a series called Life or Theatre. You know, she looked at her own life, and as such, I do wonder if there was any imitation anywhere at all. Also, because she's very, very difficult as an artist to pigeonhole. Again, she kind of is on the periphery of lots of different movements in art that were um, parallel with her work during her lifetime, expressionism and so on. But, you know, really, she kind of exists in her own orbit of everything. This work, I was reading somebody describe her work almost like an early graphic novel, that we
Yeah,
travel
just because
through the experiences of her life through these gouaches.
do you also think that I mean, this is true of both of these. This is kind of always true. I tend to think of even sometimes my own artistic output, for lack of a less pompous term, um, as sort of self-directed therapy. Um, anyway, a lot of these things, it may not necessarily be that the art is for the viewer. It could be that the art is just a mechanism for growth for the artist.
Yeah, well, I mentioned Emin
Yeah, right.
before. You know, she's constantly strung up by a baying public for this confessional kind of work that she does.
Although interestingly enough, I was reading her Wikipedia entry the other night,
Mm.
and them talking about the fact that she was this outsider or whatever it is, and now she's in the academy, and and the outsider all eventually becomes the insider. It's just it's interesting how that always happens with time. The person who is breaking the rules suddenly becomes the person who decides the rules eventually.
Mm.
That's its own life
Actually,
cycle.
even in the context you're describing now, Charlotte Sullivan is still a maverick
Mm,
because she, you know, life imitates art, art imitates life.
yep.
There are many things in her life that were so incredibly odd or tragic. And we do go on a journey with her through her art about her life. And we can't escape the terrible psychological suffering that she
Sure.
seemed to experience. This image is kind of like a self portrait with her mother. Now, the Salomon family, that wasn't obviously the mother's maiden name. The mum's family were very, very, well, unstable, I think it would be the right description. Her aunt took her own life, I think, by throwing herself in front of a train. And then in 1926, I think, her mother threw herself out of their beautiful apartment out the window. For years, the grandmother tried to tell Charlotte that it had nothing to do with mental illness, but actually it was an affliction in her mother's side of the family. And as an orphan, the grandmother, I mean, she also took her own life. So this is a family who are marred by deep and profound tragedy. And of course, I've said Charlotte herself was carted off eventually after living in hiding. For 5 years, she managed to hide successfully. Ottilie Moore was the woman. She was a German or American German who had become domiciled in France. She had a beautiful Villa Villefranche down in the south near Nice or Antibes, and she was renowned for rescuing and harboring pregnant Jews. That's what she did. She took young women who were pregnant and she hid them and their children. And she succeeded with Charlotte, and then in 1943, the game was up. And she was carted off to Auschwitz and gassed, and she was pregnant. So I love the title, Life for Theatre, because actually, you know, in both Kollwitz's work and in Charlotte Salomon's work, no matter how we look at this, their work is prescient. And the reason why I say that about Kathe Kollwitz, I'm just going to come to that and skip ahead, and I will come back to this particular image in a moment.
Yep.
In 1921, Kollwitz made a portfolio of 7 woodblock prints, obviously all the same. This is one of them. It's called The Mothers, and it's a depiction of the mothers of suffering after the First World War, particularly, where so many mothers lost sons. Yeah. And this is the same artist who before was making beautiful, poignant, profoundly sensitive artwork about, you know, mother with dead child. By this point, Kollwitz's own son had died in the war. And at this juncture in her life, she did have that personal experience of being a mother who had lost a child.
I think this is a stronger piece than the first. Both because I think I think it's a more interesting image. I think obviously her skills have even improved from the first. Her style has. I mean,
we do have a gap of 20 years.
Absolutely, yeah. But I'm just saying that it's interesting. But it's hard to differentiate in some ways for me. Whether two things. One, the thing that I said about all the different the hands and the feet, and it feels like multiple people. This is sort of the natural expression of that, where it actually is people hugging people and arms coming out of nowhere. It's taken that to the next level, but it's also difficult in some ways to differentiate whether the strength of this comes from Kollwitz's experience or greater skill over time. You know what I mean? Whether it has to do with the fact that she now knows what this feels like, or if she's just a better artist, period.
Well, I mean, her work became absolutely more stylized as she went along, and very much depicted horrors of war. As I said, I mean, she lived through both world wars. She died 16 days before the end of the Second World War.
She basically saw just all of the most horrible things humans have done to each other all in one lifetime.
She did. And sometimes I wonder with her whether the imitation was the imitation of this pure female icon, the mother,
Mhm.
and whether that is actually almost like a lie.
Like that archetype is a lie. What are you saying?
Well, to have lived through periods of enormous suffering, where there's collective suffering on a scale that we, even with a COVID pandemic, have just no clue about.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, orders of magnitude worse than what we're dealing with today.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. I do wonder if it's very easy. I don't want to say lazy, but definitely easy for us to assume that any mother is good, and that there's an elevation of what a mother is because of her status as a mother.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, before you said, I don't know if it was before we started recording, we said something about, it's not romantic in any way. Well, maybe it is romanticized somehow. And though this,
I think that concept is definitely romantic. I don't personally, I don't buy into that romanticism, but yes, that is definitely how society sees it. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wonder about ironies here to do with imitation, when perhaps better placed at this point in her life to make an image such as this, because her personal experience allows her that horrific, though necessary, portal or gateway into the emotion that becomes manifested through the art. Her son is dead.
Yep.
She is one of the mothers now, whereas she wasn't the mother before.
Yeah.
And yet in the other one, though there might be a more romantic visual feel perhaps to the first one, I don't think there was the romantic sensibility that we now see in this unity movement of the mass of mothers together as if they're one entity, and that as an entity they are undoubtedly somehow
better than the individuals.
Yeah, pure as well. This idea of like the purity of the mother.
But this also, I think, speaks to that sort of propaganda angle is also true of this one. Or certainly could be used that way.
Yeah. I'm just going to read something from, this is from Wikipedia actually. This is Kollwitz writing about what it was like living with a husband in their great big house where he had his surgery. And they lived in that really for her whole life until her house was destroyed in the war. I think it was bombed in about 1943. So she lived out the last months, year or so of her life in other places, being a guest of friends. But so she says, the motifs I was able to select from this milieu, that's the workers' lives, offers me, in a simple and forthright way, what I discovered to be beautiful. People from the bourgeois sphere were altogether without appeal or interest. All middle-class life seemed pedantic to me. On the other hand, I felt the proletariat had guts. It was not until much later, when I got to know the women who would come to my husband for help, and incidentally also to me, that I was powerfully moved by the fate of the proletariat and everything connected with this way of life. But what I would like to emphasize once more is that compassion and commiseration were at first of very little importance in attracting me to the representation of proletarian life. What mattered was simply that I found it beautiful.
Do you find beauty in pain?
I do think it's true that some of the most hauntingly beautiful images are those of suffering. I mean, there's no question at all for me that yeah, some of the most beautiful work I've ever seen has been about suffering in some way.
But do you romanticize pain in your own life? There are some people who do that, you know what I mean? Who almost like suffering because they think that there's a
no, and actually we did talk about this before. I can't remember which conversation it was, but
neither can I.
it's just shit. Oh, it was when we were talking about poverty.
Right.
It's just rubbish to be grindingly poor.
Yeah.
It really is. We know that. So no, I don't think I do it really in my own life.
Yeah.
But I see it all the time in art, and it can be
I mean,
transportingly beautiful.
there is. I mean, as we were saying about the archetype of the mother and child period,
Mm,
um, I think that individual experiences of individual people are intense and are personal, obviously, and are meaningful to them. But
mm,
that in a lot of ways, the it's the aggregate of that experience through a population. It's all of the mothers who lost children, or all of the men who died in war, or
yeah,
all of the poor people, or all of the displaced, Jews, say, or whatever, right? That
right.
that 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 story is what people really hang on almost more than the individual stories.
But isn't
And
that
that's where the archetypes get built up,
isn't
right?
isn't
That's
that fascinating in this context? Because here we have a mother who has herself experienced the profound loss of her child dying. And yet the representation we find of that kind of loss by this point in her career is much less about the I, the individual, the
it's the
self.
we. Yeah.
It's this unified sense of all mothers. Now, I do wonder about this also for anybody listening. Again, sometimes I say things and I think people must imagine I'm totally crackers. But when I had my child, I was very unwell psychologically afterwards for quite a long time. And I don't make a secret of that. I don't feel that I should be ashamed of that, and nor should I be shamed by others because of it. It was a very, very difficult time and a very difficult transition from my life before into my life as being a mother, which was not at all actually about my child and was entirely about me.
Yep.
But I do remember being in Bournemouth and feeling incredibly disturbed that I suddenly felt as if I now had an indelible, inextricable link to the entire world of mothers. That there was some almost like a radar in me picking up on the commonality of being a mother with every other mother, and that
Sure.
that could be the mother next to me on the bus, or likewise it could be a mother in a totally different place, perhaps even a totally different time. And because I was very unwell at the time, I actually believed that I could not hear, but that I was experiencing the suffering of other mothers. Like that's I know that that's not a well-adjusted person's way of thinking or feeling about the world, but I was suffering from horrific postnatal depression at the time. But I really, even now, one might argue better adjusted, uh, do still think that there is a sense that though I might not be good because I'm a mother, nonetheless, there's some kind of communality with other mothers.
Do you think though that common definition of mother that you're subscribing to in this case, by merging everyone together like we were talking about a minute ago,
Mm.
you're also sort of uh, removing the simple uh, faults of some of the individuals in that class to some
Well,
extent.
that's
You know
what
what I
I'm
mean?
saying about, we suddenly
Some of these mothers could be neglectful of their kid and that's why the kid died, and you know what I mean, but it doesn't matter because they're
yes,
mothers and therefore they're feeling the same pain.
this is what I'm talking about to do with
Yeah.
our identifications and conditionings, where we see mothers as good,
Yeah.
in the same way that we see children as pure.
Yep.
Or, dare I say it, we often see men as bad and predators.
Yep.
There's so many ways in which we do lump everything in together, and through our identification processes and our need to
Yeah.
reject or assimilate what we know, we find that we are, it's a real folly, isn't it, to assume that everyone
Absolutely. We
is
assume that the death of a
completely
child is
sane.
worse than the death of a 25-year-old. It's like, well, why? Because they have more life to live. Well, they've also built up less life. They have less life to lose. You know what I mean? To have lost. You know what I mean? Like, there's all kinds of things. The young kid may have become a serial killer when they grew up, and the other person may have, cured cancer. You never know,
So,
right?
it brings us back to Charlotte Salomon.
Yep.
And she was still, I don't know how old she was when her mother took her own life. So she was born in 1917. I think her mum took her life in 1926. So she would have been, what's
Do
that?
the math. Come on. 9.
Hang on. 9. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Um, so she was still really actually little. She was a little girl when this happened.
Sure.
Her mother had gone through a period of kind of psychosis before she died, where apparently she would go to the window every night and she would say that they had to watch for angels. They had to watch for them, and that was something they did together.
You think that's where some of this imagery comes from?
Yeah, so I think this is this an imitation of an idea, or or is this the closest we can possibly get to somebody else's experience?
It is interesting though that when you tell me that story as somebody who is not a parent, like a parent to any child, I
Mm.
think I hear that story and I think somebody has to go take that child away from that crazy woman who's like abusing her child.
Well, the abuse didn't stop there, sadly. And also,
Sure.
there's so much in this story, and in so many ways, also, sometimes the story overtakes the art. Because Charlotte Solomon's life was punctuated, as I said already, by enormous tragedy. But it was almost like it was the life that kept on giving these huge experiences, not just like the bimbling along life that so many of us lead. There were things that happened in her life that were just incredible. And again, though unlike Kollwitz, she didn't live a long life, the fact is that in her short life, she still experienced enormous amounts of collective suffering as well, and
Did
fear.
she show signs of mental illness herself?
I don't know. I mean, are we in the running for some value judgments this evening? Because I'm going to just
No,
tell.
I'm just wondering, had she lived a quote unquote normal life, if she would have gone down a similar path to her mother or her grandmother.
Well, I mean, her maternal grandparents, as I said, took her. They whisked her away. They realized that, in 1933, obviously Hitler had come into power as chancellor. He started chasing Jews all over the place, and lots of people tried to really disappear themselves at that, in the 30s, didn't they? Especially those people like the Salomon family, who were well connected, very wealthy, highly cultured. Um, her her grandparents, as I said, her grandmother eventually did too take her own life, also by jumping out a window. I
Not a
mean,
good way to go, by the way.
it's just sort of just incredible, this punctuation of death. Her grandfather was her tormentor. In fact, there are one or two surviving gouaches of like the Third Reich and things that Charlotte had observed in maybe not rallies, but certainly gatherings and political protests and things like that. Or yeah, rallies, I suppose. But really, she cited her grandfather as kind of like worse than Hitler. Like that was her enemy. The enemy to evade was her grandfather. And that's because, and this is alleged by her, he abused her, he sexually abused her. And we know that when he was an old man, and once her grandmother had died, she poisoned him and murdered him.
Yeah, I get that.
Now, all of this comes out in her work. I mean, it's completely extraordinary. That's why this exists in an oeuvre really all of its own for its time. I just think her entire way of working was about bringing us as close as possible to not an imitation of anything, the actuality of the thing.
In
And
somewhat,
also,
good.
was she ever aware that she even had or would have an audience?
Well, that goes back to my theory of her doing it as as
Therapy.
as a coping mechanism.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, uh, this kind of goes back to my common line about everyone thinks that however they grew up and their experiences are normal because they have nothing really to compare it against. Everyone thinks their parents, that's the way parents are. And only later in life do you usually realize, oh, wow, no, either my mother was great or my father was a jerk or he was an alcoholic or he was fantastic and my mother was loony. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
whatever the thing is, you really only realize it in hindsight because you're a kid. Your entire world is being built by these people who you have no comparison of anyone, in a similar role. You only have
I
those
think what
ones.
unifies all these images, but actually especially the first two for me, is it's the sense of tenderness. I find these images very tender, and I know you said that now you know the story. You sort of hope someone will walk in uh, off the side of the canvas and take the child away from that crazy lady. But
Yeah,
the fact is that this is a child and her mother in the mother's bed, having that quiet, very intimate, very um, deeply connected beyond any measure sense of being with each other, sharing a story, sharing something that is beyond the ordinary. Even though actually, though the story isn't ordinary, the fact is the act of this is very ordinary for a lot of mothers with their children.
sure, but you're putting on some glasses, even assuming that is actually how it was between the two of them in that bed, and the story she was telling her. Maybe Charlotte was terrified of the stories her mother was telling her, and she didn't want to be in that bed, and her mother was keeping her there. Like, we don't know, you know.
Maybe. But as I said, the way I read it is that there's an
Of
enormous
course you do.
tenderness.
That's because you buy into the the perfect mother myth. It's interesting. I don't think none of us are immune to any of these things, right?
No,
Um, I mean, it's part of our interpretation of the world around us, the relationships we have with other people, on top of art that we're seeing from a two steps removed.
can we really, really focus though, you and I now, give it our complete attention? This question of imitation.
Sure.
Like, is art simply imitation or is art experience?
I think that without any other prior knowledge or Wikipedia entries, I don't know that you can tell authenticity of experience within an artist's work or not. I think you're going. I think you can look in hindsight and say, "Oh, now that I know everything that Charlotte Salomon went through, I can see realness in this experience of what she's showing in this." But this could also just as easily have been a dream that she had.
Well, I mean, lots of them are very dreamlike, but I don't think
Sure.
that disqualifies it or is mutually exclusive to experience.
No, but I don't think it's evidentiary of experience either.
In the same way that when I know I know the kind of the history of this image, but you know, Kathe Kollwitz herself hadn't experienced this kind of loss at this point in her life, though she was aware of it, she observed it. And whether this then, no matter how extraordinarily poignant this image is. The fact is it is a reproduction of an observation, rather even than a reproduction of an experience from the artist. And also, I think that's a really interesting part of this too. Again, I think we said it right at the very beginning. Does an artist have to have an authority within an experience or a place or even an emotion in order to not just adequately, but rightly represent whatever that thing might be?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no, they do not.
But why do you say that, Bill?
Because I think people have shown that some people understand things they've never experienced, and some people don't understand things they have experienced.
Mm.
Um,
Do you know anybody really though who can at the deepest level understand loss without experiencing loss? Or is this a much bigger question for humanity?
well, yeah, but that's in their head. That's not necessarily in the things that they make or the way they represent how they're feeling. I think that, listen, I've been there and watched a number of people that I care about die in front of me. And could I quite understand what that experience is like before it happened? I think I had an idea of what it would be like.
Mm. I have an idea of things.
Yeah.
But, I'm very cautious about this because I have a very, very close friend who lost her dad a few years ago.
Yep.
And I must never, ever be so insensitive as to suggest that I understand what it's like to lose a parent.
Right.
Because both my parents are alive. Now, it doesn't matter how sensitive I am or how aware I am of the loss. The loss is only an observation on my part. It's not the experience.
Yes, but what I'm saying is I think that there are some people who even if they have experienced that, don't take anything away from it or learn a lesson or even take the time to understand the thing they went through in order to come out the other side with something valuable. And that somebody who hasn't experienced it may think about that kind of experience enough to where they have a perspective on it that people who went through it don't even have. I think that's wholly possible.
But that's still different to having experienced the thing, whatever it might be.
Well, I mean, is there a certain question of whether, in this case, we are somehow fetishizing experience, as in, oh, you couldn't possibly understand what it's like. In your case, I'm putting words in your mouth for effect. You can't possibly understand what it's like to be a mother. I'm a mother. You, as a man who doesn't even have kids, could never understand what it's like to be a mother. That's true. And I guess in some ways you can't understand what it's like to lose your father like I did, right? But I think that you and I know each other well enough at this point where I can imagine what it's like to have a child. I can imagine how much I personally would love that child.
Hang on, hold on. In
Go ahead.
context of this example you're giving though,
Yeah.
do you understand through what you know of me how it feels to be a mother? And likewise, do I understand loss through you about specifically the death of your father?
Well, no, but that is also, that goes back to the whole question of personal experience versus sort of the archetype of that experience. It's like, sure, yeah.
This is so fascinating as an exercise for us because.
But we don't know whether she saw herself in this picture.
No, I don't know if she did. I mean, she really did rather, I think, selflessly depict not just herself. She was resolute about showing the collective suffering of these women that she encountered. I mean, you heard the quote, the kind of about the sort of the proletariat, the everyman
Sure.
who's otherwise overlooked. Well, these women can't be overlooked as a mass because there's so many of them who have lost
Yes, but
children.
even in that quote, her discussing the middle class and the proletariat, she was putting these labels on groups, like vast groups of people who themselves, some of the people in the middle class and some of the people in the proletariat were real jerks who were, and some people were godlike people in those groups on either side of that, you know. So I think that it's she could also have been looking at this particular thing and have been making almost a mythological representation of mothers, you know?
Right. So then I think, again, there's another question that could come out of this, which is that when we mythologize, are we actually just making something that's already within our realm of experience into another version of itself?
I think we're taking individual experience and trying to make it universal.
Mm. I could keep talking about this for a really long time. I find this endlessly fascinating. I really do. I would love to explore more the notion of art as experience. I mean, John Dewey wrote about this. Um, again, very fine exploration of what we're talking about now in our more kind of layman's terms. But um,
There's
are we
also, by the way, go ahead, finish your thought.
just are we imitating when we make art, or are we doing something else?
Yeah. I think we are doing something else. And I think that you and I tend to look at, or up until now, are looking very much at specific types of 2D visual art is generally what we're looking at. But the experience that a musician has while they're playing or a dancer has while they're moving
Mm,
is also, they're the art forms that where time is of another dimension.
yeah.
I mean, there's experience over time there that the artist is going through that
Well,
is different than the viewer. It's
a few weeks ago now, I spoke to Alistair about this. Dr. Heron, Dr. Alistair from Ulster University.
yeah.
I was talking about, is the past alive, and in context of art, obviously. And really, what you're just sort of coming up upon there, this idea that like what is the currency of something that is actually a living art form that is breathed life into through the actions of, let's say, a musician or a dancer.
which
And
which is my first experience of art. I was a musician way before I was a visual artist of any kind. Yeah.
but I do wonder then about our visual art version of this, and whether that in itself has to be dead by its very nature, because it's
Yeah.
always held in the past.
Always in the past. It's never in the present. Where somebody could sit up and play Olio right now and, they might have the same experience that Charlie Parker had while playing Olio in 1946.
But does that create a status layer for different kinds of art? One thing has a different sense of immediacy to another.
Well, certainly certain forms of art are far more important to society than others. You know,
Do
we
tell
we
us, Bill. You're saying something very controversial there.
you don't think that that's true? Of course that's true. I mean, we
Hang on, don't wriggle out of it. Explain that.
okay, you and I can go to MoMA or the Louvre or wherever, and there's a whole lot of paintings on the wall, but there aren't giant rooms full of baskets from 1946
Mm-hmm.
in most museums, right? So arts and crafts are certainly tend to be on a second level down from the high arts that the West has decided are important.
Yep.
um, I tend to not have as much. Why is it that oil paints are better than acrylic paints, are better than colored pencils, are better than chalk on a sidewalk? I mean, these are all, this is the way this works. I'm not saying it should work that way. I'm not sure I say I agree with it.
I wondered if you were going to tell us there whether you thought that music was superior to visual art.
I have never felt, while listening to music or making music or playing music, I personally feel an intensity of emotion and reaction that is far deeper than anything I've ever made or seen or felt looking at visual art. So for me, yeah, I think that music in particular has a far deeper direct connection. It injects a line far deeper into the brain than visual art does. Visual art needs to be interpreted. I don't think that music needs to be interpreted. Your brain automatically does it. Hot take.
I think we're going to need to finish there.
Okay. And next episode is where I pull in a whole bunch of music and we listen to it.
I think we should.
Okay.
Anyway, Art is Experience, John Dewey. Go read it. Also, Kathe Kollwitz. Go find out about her. And Life or Theatre, Bill. Charlotte Salomon. I hope you find out more about her. An extraordinary.
I need to go look at some of the other in the series. I think that'll help.
Anyway, I will see you next time.
All right, Sandi, thank you so much.